Well, across Canada, for anybody who's read the news, food banks are kind of everywhere. And everywhere across the country, they've reached record numbers that they haven't ever before. London is no different in that regard. We're up at 10,000 individuals a month that we're trying to help just directly at the food bank. That doesn't count the other agencies that we assist as well. But across the country, this is a common story. And there's no better person to go and talk to about that than the person who's with me here today. Kirsten Beardsley is CEO of Food Banks Canada. Now, Kirsten, I think you've been with them. Is it 8 years?
8 years, yeah. This in a week, actually.
In a week, and CEO for the last 5 months.
Exactly,
Right.
yes.
It's interesting, I think, because you've been through a bit of you're looking through your mandate and designing how you wanted to move into the future, and you pick these new things, and then all of a sudden, all of this stuff starts happening. So, an interesting time of challenge for you. But I remember, Kristen, it was in 1987 at the very beginning. We had all whatever food banks could come from across Canada to London, and we met at the University of Western Ontario, who hosted us there. And that then moved on and became part of an inaugural meeting that we had that year for establishing what was then called Canadian Association of Food Banks, now Food Banks Canada. But that's how far back it goes. And I remember back in those days, people were talking about things like sunset clauses or food banks won't be around much for very long. Government's got to do more. And I mean, people really, I think, believed in that. And now here we are 36 years later, and we're having these kind of discussions. It's kind of tough. But in your 8 years at Food Banks Canada, which really is a membership based organization from across the country, correct? In your 8 years of being there, what kind of changes have you seen just in that while?
I've seen a number of changes. I've seen food banks be incredibly innovative and very community oriented. I always say this from a national lens. The beauty of food banking is its diversity. You
Yeah.
can go, you can't, one food bank in one city is not the same as the one the next town over. It's a challenge nationally, obviously, to talk about this thing called food banking, but I've seen a lot of movement towards making sure folks who come to our services have the food that they need, whether that's more fresh food, whether that's culturally appropriate food. I've seen a lot of movement towards meeting communities where they are,
Mhm.
um, and providing a dignified service and continuing those conversations with the communities we serve. And then, obviously the last 2.5 some odd years with the pandemic, I saw that innovation
Yeah.
grow, exponentially. I don't think people understand. I don't think anyone in this country outside of food banking understands how much food bankers provided during the pandemic, and the spirit of just, okay, what are we meeting today? We'll change, we'll adapt, we'll make it work so that people have the food they need. So that's one of the things I want people to understand about food banking is that it's very community driven and very innovative. And the people driving food banking across the country are really have just this magical spirit of community service.
Yeah, we've really felt that in London. It's been a time of real renaissance for us, for instance, since the pandemic's happened. I know that's happened elsewhere. But I think people need to know that Food Banks Canada isn't this kind of group where we get together and just share information, see how we're doing, right? I think a big part of our success as a London food bank has been the intervention from Food Banks Canada at so many different levels, whether it's policy, whether it's research, but above all, like the sharing of food or funds, because you folks have really worked really well with food companies and with the corporate sector about fundraising and stuff. Can you go over that with us a bit? Because we have benefited from that, and it'd be helpful to hear it directly from you how that works.
Yeah, of course. So we have this two-part mission at Food Banks Canada. So it's relieving hunger today and preventing hunger tomorrow. And I know a lot of food banks have a similar mission. And so the relieving hunger today part is where we source food and funds to support food banking across the country. And then the preventing hunger tomorrow is the longer term solutions. And we tie those two together with research.
Yeah.
In terms of sourcing funds and food, a lot of that is, we've got this national perspective. We've got, we work with corporations that want to support food banks, support relieving food insecurity. and yet probably don't want to have 750 individual relationships across the country. They want one point of contact.
Yep.
So one of the things that I think is a bit of a secret that people don't know about is we have at Food Banks Canada a logistics team. So we have a group of folks on we call them the food team. They source food, they work with national organizations to find opportunities. And then we've got people who are making connections, whether that's we move food by rail, by plane, by truck, to every corner of the country to make sure that there's an equitable distribution. So if you're in Newfoundland or if you're in BC, and even we've expanded into the far north, you're getting access to some of that food that tends to exist in Ontario and southwestern Ontario, where we have most of the food manufacturing. So that's one of our key roles is making sure there's this equitable distribution.
Yeah, and I think for instance, going through the pandemic suddenly meant that the challenges before us were immense. All food banks are doing that, but groups like the federal government, for instance, would look at that and say, how can we help people with food insecurity problems during the pandemic when they're afraid to go to grocery stores or there's shortage of supply lines or whatever it is. And they chose to work through Food Banks Canada to distribute the funds that were so necessary to help keep people. And do you know how that came about? Like, did you sit down and have meetings with them, or did they just trust Food Banks Canada that way? Because you've been around a long time and just approached you and just decided to steer it through that way. How did that come about?
It came about, we have longstanding relationships with the federal government, as you said. That's part of a key part of our mandate. So we have relationships with the key ministries that deal with issues around poverty and housing and disability, as well as the food insecurity file, which lives with Agriculture Canada, our AAFC. And so it came about because they knew they had to respond. We drafted a letter to government with some of our partners in the food insecurity space early in the pandemic saying, you really need to take this issue seriously.
Yeah.
And I'm thrilled that they did. And yes, we met very regularly. I would say in those early days when food banks were scrambling, we were meeting with government probably 4, 5, 6, 7 times a week sometimes, to just talk about how we deliver this. And we've worked in partnership, as I said, Breakfast Club of Canada, community food centers, Salvation Army, other folks that do this kind of work. We all came together and we each designed a way of getting the funds as far reaching as they could into communities. And I'm so proud of the way food banks responded. And, I know the funds were so necessary and needed. And the food, even the government brokered some food relationships for industries that were hurt by the shutdown of
Yeah.
hospitality industries. So it was both we were there, we were doing the work, we're trusted in our communities. MPs across the country know their local food banks. So we were already trusted, and then we worked to build the relationship. So when we were called on to deliver the funds, we were there.
So from our standpoint, from the receiving end, Food Banks Canada and also like London Food Bank and all of the others, it's a wonderful thing. But from the federal government level and from the ministries level, the ability, I think, to have Food Banks Canada, consider what it would have been like if it didn't exist. They would have to either work with provincial associations or with individual food banks. It would have taken a long time to roll that out, right? But what they chose to do was to work through Food Banks Canada, who already has those relationships with food banks. So it wasn't just a clearinghouse, so to speak, where the funds could be given, you could distribute it. You could distribute it in a way that reflected the regions in which those people were in. I think that must have been a great benefit to the federal government to be able to have that as an outlet.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think that's the value of having an organization. And we worked very closely with the provincial organizations and made sure those funds made them out quickly. Sometimes when I go back and I'm looking for, reports and emails from those early days, I can't believe actually how quickly it all moved. I mean, some of
Yeah.
those funds made their way across the country before the end of March 2020. And
Yeah.
then we've been recipients of other waves of funding. But yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it was a benefit that we had this system in place, that we knew how to work together, that we have grants that we already run. So we just ran, we know how to do a granting program. because we often invest in food banks. And then the food banks themselves are very accountable for those funds. So very aware of the need to report back, which I don't think is the case always with organizations that were maybe newer on the ground. And so
Yeah.
I think we responded, we solved a problem and met a community need that definitely the government appreciates. And also, we help them to be accountable for those funds.
And we can't forget that during that time, a lot of corporations showed up. Like they definitely did at London. I mean, within the first month after the pandemic started, we were meeting with businesses who were saying, "How can we help?" There was kind of an empathy that was there was an outpouring at the beginning of it towards the homeless, towards people with food insecurity, and when corporations came forward, they were doing the same thing. They were trying to find a channel through which they could donate. Now, I know that Food Banks Canada has relationships with groups like Walmart and others, but can you go over that just with us a bit, how you work with the corporate sector or the business sector across the country and how you facilitate that?
Yeah, of course. So one of the roles, like again, of Food Banks Canada is to work with national companies that
Yeah.
want to invest in food banking, and we try to make it easy for them to invest. One point of contact. They often have one national team working on their corporate social responsibility file. And so we help them with that. So we have a whole corporate fundraising team that
Mm.
works with these companies. And again, we've seen, as you said, during the pandemic, food insecurity certainly became a high priority for a number of companies. And yet they're not necessarily experts on how to take that energy or that guidance or that will from their employees and their leadership and turn it into action. And that's where the Food Banks Canada team can help out. So we work with those teams, we help design whatever program works for them, and then we get those funds out across the country so they have an impact on the ground. So that's one of the roles that we play. And then the relationships with some of the grocery retailers like Walmart are unique because it's not just that they fund us, give us funds, but there's a food relationship as well. So the grocery stores, anything that's going to be close to code or is not fit for sale, but is still healthy for human consumption, we've matched them with food banks across the country, and it goes into the food bank. So it's a bit of a deeper relationship on that side with Loblaw and Walmart.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that's true. I mean, the national corporations and stuff would really kind of do need a national group to work through. I think that's really true. We were incorporated in 1986 as a food bank, but back then when we first met with other food banks, there weren't many. They were beginning to really take off, but there weren't that many. And we would meet in London or we would meet in Kingston or Toronto, and there would be Kingston, ourselves, Kitchener, Chatham, Toronto, and Montreal. Right, like Montreal came up, and they would come in and have these meetings with them. We met every 3 months, and we were like people who suddenly were put in charge of a ship with no maps or anything else. We were just trying to figure out how we were going to get through this. But Montreal's way of looking at it was totally different than ours, and it was so fascinating. They were awesome. They came and they worked with us, and it was great. But soon enough, they wanted to hive off and start their own provincial organization that represented their sensitivities and other things. And we wished them Godspeed as they went, and they've been awesome. But you, as a food bank, Food Banks Canada, you have to deal with, is it 10 provincial associations? Right. Do you find that they're all really pretty different, or do you find that they're largely the same?
No, they're pretty different, I would say. Different perspectives, different approaches, and different models. So we've the two models of provincial association. There's one that's more of an association like Ontario, where all the food banks in the province are members, and it's a similar mandate to Food Banks Canada, but at a provincial level. So supporting the food banks within the province, but also advocating provincially. And then we've got a hub model. So in half of the country, the largest food bank, or half of the provinces, the largest food bank is also the provincial organization. So they
See.
play this, you know, this advocacy role, they play the member service role, but they also do a significant amount of food acquisition and distribution across the province. So that's one way they're different. As you said, there's different approaches. So in some regions, I would say we tend more towards a social service organization. We are about making sure there's the right food to the right people at the right time. And in other places, it's an environmental response. Not that they aren't, we aren't doing both all the time, but for some, it's about removing food waste. Any sort of food waste that's healthy and safe and consumable, removing that from getting to landfill and making sure that gets to folks.
Yeah.
So that's one approach that's a bit different. And just, we meet with the provincial associations regularly, and we're getting into different membership models, different fee structures. So it's very different. And again, it's the beauty of it and some of the challenge of it as well, is that it's very diverse across the country.
And what about Indigenous communities? What kind of access do you have there that you bring? Because I know that that's important to you.
Yes, so we're building relationships. So every provincial association has this as a priority. I don't think anyone doesn't see this as a significant priority, but again, very different relationships and projects across the country. We have built especially over the pandemic, prior to, but now really through the pandemic and the reach of some of our funding, really built some relationships in the far north that we didn't have before.
Yeah.
So just for context, food insecurity rates in Nunavut are 4 times what they are in Ontario, for example. It's at a crisis level. It was before the pandemic. It will likely get worse. And there are these community leaders across Nunavut who we've been able to reach and figure out how to support. I think with Indigenous communities, it's making sure that we're in the right role, which is a supportive role, making sure that what we're doing is providing, whether that's financial or knowledge sharing support, whatever it is but the community itself is in the driver's seat of whatever change they're bringing. And it's requiring us to think a little bit differently about the support. One of the grants that we gave out during the pandemic, which wasn't even, we got many millions of dollars to support, which was needed. And this was I think a $10,000, maybe $12,000 grant. So not a big grant in the context. And it was for a Northern First Nation in Alberta. And they had the lake that the First Nation used for fishing, or one of the lakes on the First Nation, was, overfished, and there wasn't a good source of fish anymore. But the road to the other lake had been grown over. And so the funding went to hire 2 people to clear the road. And then elders came and taught the community traditional ways of fishing and preparing food. And that created a sustainable source of fish.
Wow.
And that's not food banking, or that's not what we think of food banking, but we were able to support a community with a food security initiative. So it's things like that I think are going to push us to think differently about how we support Indigenous communities.
Yeah.
But I'm excited. I'm really excited that this is where we go next as a system.
Yeah. And I want to talk to you more about that at some point, because I think we work with a group called Sandy Lake, which is up in Northern Ontario. Highest rate of type 2 diabetes in the world is there. But we've been trying to help them to get back to traditional harvesting, what they've been doing. But just how you go about that, it's a whole different matter, and it's good for us to learn to be sensitive in those areas. So I want to talk to you about that at some point. But I did want to talk about, it's interesting that you came in as the CEO 5 months ago, but you folks had just been through a process of prioritizing where you were now going to go as a national organization. Now, I know that you and I were part of a conference, Zoom conference together about a month ago, and you brought up that advocacy was actually one thing that you were very, very passionate about. What does that look like from a Food Banks Canada point of view? When you talk about advocacy, what do you mean?
When I talk about advocacy, I mean a couple of things. One is traditional lobbying of government for social change. We know that while the work that food banks do is critical, and as you said, I love hearing about the history of food banking. Some food bankers thought this this model would have a sunset and be gone. And here we are providing essential services across this country. We need to also advocate so that we don't normalize some of, the things like homelessness, like extreme poverty, like exclusions of people with disabilities from being able to afford, the necessities of life. So it's important that we advocate at all levels of government for the social policies that we need. And we've done that. That's been part of Food Banks Canada's mandate for a long time. We've got team members in Ottawa who build those relationships with folks on Parliament Hill. And I think where I want to take our advocacy is building a sense of a movement for social change. Food banks, I can't tell you, I've mentioned it already, but food banks are so well respected in their communities and have relationships, as you know, with all levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal. And if we can sort of figure out how to come together, whether that's around certain issues or at certain times to create this change, I really think that we have an opportunity and an obligation to those we serve to make some real changes. And the times are tough, as you said. The food bank use is at its highest level from coast to coast to coast right now, and we need smart, creative solutions that bring that number of people who need us down.
Yeah, it really is my sense that part of the reasons why food banks are so highly trusted is because the shareholders are the citizens themselves primarily, but also associations and businesses. So it's a reflection of the community itself. That's part of the reason why it's trusted, because people look at food banks and see themselves in the mirror. And I think that's a really important piece. It doesn't seem to be detached or whatever it is. It's sensitive to where people are at. And I think the other thing, Kirsten, that I've discovered from talking with other food banks as well, I think the pandemic actually changed the way that food banks are perceived a bit. I think we've gone from being this, traditional, kind of homogeneous group with all of these different sectors of community and helping to kind of a stateswoman role, if that's the right word, where all of a sudden now, I think it's coming through the pandemic, food banks did such, I think, a significant and principled job of directing all of these resources and the government largesse and others, corporate, as you talked about, that I think we are now at a place where we can actually, this is the wrong way of putting it, but broker certain things. To some degree, our influence is more important than our food resources. We have gotten to this point where we have, I think, across the country, proved adept at bringing different groups together to look at a problem and try to manage it. Has that been your sense? Because it's definitely been mine for here in London, but also just from other food banks that I've talked to. And if true, then it puts food banks in a role which can facilitate the very thing you're talking about. Is that what you're sensing?
Yes, absolutely. I'm the same as you. I think that we, and from the steps removed that I am from the front lines that you all were at, I was so proud to be even a small part of this work during the pandemic, because I think what happened, leaders lead, and we led during the pandemic. We didn't shy away from the need. Everyone just went all in to say, we are going to be here for our communities. And that trust, everyone witnessed it. We didn't shut doors. We didn't, we made our operations as safe as possible. We got food on the shelves when even people going to the grocery store were having trouble getting food on their shelves. We stepped into that leadership role, and I do think that's what's going to carry us through to have these important conversations with government. I mean, it matters to be able to talk to any level of government that you've got people on the ground who say, yeah, this is a trusted organization. I work with them, people I know volunteer with them. My kids go, they come to my kids' school and talk about food insecurity. It matters, those community connections. And that absolutely happened, in all across the country. And so we are in a very solid position. I agree with you. I think we changed from being a bit old-fashioned, or the perception of us as being old-fashioned, to modern, innovative, forward-thinking, community-driven organizations, which we are. And
Yeah.
I think now we have to take that forward because the times aren't easier for food banks, unfortunately, right now. Maybe a little less chaotic, but certainly tough.
Yeah. Kirsten, it's very interesting that you and I have never met.
It is.
Other than on that Zoom panel call from a month ago. But I was telling my wife Jane this morning that I don't know where we would be as a food bank without Food Banks Canada. Now, we're charter members of Food Banks Canada. We were there at the beginning. But if I had a way, and there is, I just haven't had the time for it, but if I had a way to count all the different ways in which this corporate sector, in the government sector, and other policy, research, all of those kind of things, how we had benefited from Food Banks Canada, we wouldn't be nearly where we were at. And I think what's been helpful for us hasn't been just the resources, it's been the research or the on the spot news that's coming out. Like you folks post every week about this stuff. But we suddenly realize we're not alone in this universe. Food Bank in New Brunswick is going through the same thing as we are, or Indigenous community in Northern Manitoba is going through some real troubles. I think food banks are who they are in large part because of who they are collectively, but we don't know that very much. We don't know what the others are doing. It's really you folks that have made that work. So I just do want to say, as a London food bank, and I love this job. I've been at it 36 years. I just love it. But we wouldn't be nearly as far if it wasn't for Food Banks Canada. And I really appreciate all that you've done for us. And I told you at the beginning of this, you have two standing invitations. One is we want to see you in London because
Yeah.
it's a wonderful community and I want to show you what it's done. But the other is I'd like to talk to you again in 2 or 3 weeks if we can, Kirsten. Let's dig down a little bit deeper into this food security thing and more what needs to be done. Are you up for that? Because that would be great for us.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Anytime. And I absolutely want to get to London and see the food bank and the community. So
I know that
yeah,
would be really good.
thank you. Thank you for your kind words about
It's
Food
so
Banks
true.
Canada. I think,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's true.
so we're that step removed. And so sometimes you hope the work that you're doing is having an impact. So
Yeah.
it's nice to hear that it does.
I have to say though, in that initial founding meeting back at University of Western Ontario, I don't think we knew just how effective Food Banks Canada could become. We talked about the need for a national presence because this was happening in every province. But I don't think I ever saw just how effective it would become. And the fact that we are more effective than we thought we would be is in large part due to Food Banks Canada. So it's benefited you that you've got an empowered membership, and it's definitely benefited us that we've got this, empowered collective way, headquarters way of helping us and getting us the resources we need to get by. It's really a great partnership all the way across the board and across each province. So it's awesome. I'll be in touch, Kristen, and we'll talk again in a couple of weeks.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.